Let's test that we can update habits and also test data validation. Before we begin, I'd like to change the wording of these tests. I noticed that I don't like to have the word that at the beginning, so let's remove it, as well as the from the first one. Now create a test, call it habits can be updated. Let's create a new habit in the database using the factory and define the payload of the updated habit. Then send a pull request to update the habit. Pass the habit ID in the URL and the updated habit as the payload. Then assert that we are redirected back to the habits list and also that we have a record in the database with the same habit ID but with the updated habit information. Let's create a new route for this request. I'll duplicate the one for store, change the request to put, include the habit ID as a parameter in the URL, and then change the action and the route name. Now let's add the update method to the controller. Let's return a redirection to the habits index route. And now we need to update the habit. Add the request and habit as parameters. I'll use implicit binding for the habit. And then call habit update. I'll copy this array from the store method and use it here. And we get a passing test. That was easy, right? There is no rework needed, so let's move on to validation. Starting with the creation of habits. I want to make sure that I can't create a habit without a name. So test habits cannot be created without name. I'll set up a new habit using factory make, but override the name and set it to null. Then make a post request to habits and pass the habit payload. Notice that I'm not using without exception handling. This is because I'm not interested in the exact exception name, only the errors returned by the validation process. And now I want to make sure that the session has errors related to the name. So response, assert, session has errors, and then we pass an array with the error keys. In this case, name. Now let's add the validation. For now, I'll just create the validation logic using request validate, and then set the name as required. I want to rework this validation and put it inside a FormRequest class. So in the terminal, create a new request called store habit request. You can find the new request inside app HTTP requests. By default, the authorize function will return false. But we don't have any authorization in this project, so just remove the authorize function. In the rules, set the name to required. Go back to the controller and instead of request, use store habit request. And remove the current validation. The data will be validated before reaching the controller. And if we test again, it still works. Let's do the same for times per day. I'll duplicate this entire test and replace all instances of name with times per day. Add a rule for times per day and set it as required. This is totally fine when dealing with just 2 fields, but imagine if we had 4, 5, or even 10 fields. We would have to create a test for each one, which is not good. So let's use data providers instead. First, let's remove all of this and then create 2 functions. One will be the test. So test create habits validation. And another function that will serve as a data provider for the test. Let's call it provide bad habit data. Right above the test, we can use a doc block to set the data provider for this test. Just say data provider and the name of the function. provide bad habit data. Now let's focus on how the data provider works. This function must return an array. And each entry in this array is another array, also known as a dataset. Think of a dataset as the data that will be provided to the test. The test will run once for each dataset. Inside the dataset, we define the arguments that will be passed as parameters to the test function. For example, if this array had A, B, and C, the test function will receive 3 parameters. Let's also call them A, B, and C. The values for these parameters correspond to the entries in the dataset array. If we wrap these 3 values inside an array, then the test function will receive only one parameter. Let's call it data. And this data array will have 3 values, A, B, and C. And this is exactly what we need. Let's rename this to habit. And instead of A, B, and C, let's use an associative array with name test and times per day 3. Let's duplicate this entire array, and now we have 2 datasets. On the first array, we can set name to null, and on the second one, we can set times per day to null. But one thing that I don't like is that I have to include valid and invalid data on each dataset, and that can lead to errors when you have big datasets. So instead, let's create a habit up here using factory make. Then on each dataset, I'll use habit to array with the spread operator. In this way, all the valid data is included and I only override the field I want to test. Now for the test, I'll make a post request to habits and then send the habit as payload. And for the assertion, I'll use response assert session has errors. But here I need to pass the field name that I'm testing for. So let's do this. In the data provider before the habit array, let's add a string with the field name we are testing validation for. So name and times per day. And in the test, we add this string as the first parameter. Let's call it missing. Now we just pass that in the assertion. Okay, let's test again and see how this looks. We can see here that the test ran twice, and the second execution actually used the dataset number 1. This is a bit confusing since I can't clearly see what field was tested. We can fix this by adding a description to the dataset. Go back to the data provider, and before each dataset, we can provide a key with the description. For example, this one is for missing name, and the second one is for missing times per day. And if we run the test again, now we get a better idea of what field was tested. Okay, to finish up, I will leave you with some homework. Your task is to implement the validation for updating habits. Here are a few hints to help you out. Start with a failing test and move from there. Make use of the data provider we just created. It's your call if you want to use a FormRequests class, but I highly recommend it. Follow the same naming convention. If the name of the store request was store habit request, then the name of the update request should be update habit request. Try your best to work on this on your own, and I'll show you my solution in the next video. I'll see you in the next one.